My name is Tristan Devocelle, and I did my presentation on symbolic interactionism and leadership. So, the social issue I would like to focus on is what causes American politicians to be consistently unable to serve the people. Um, so, to explain this, American politicians just don't meet the needs of the people, and when the people have the opportunity to vote in elections, there are no good options for them. They feel like they're voting between the better of two evils instead of voting for a good leader who will serve them. Um, so the sociological lens that I chose to use for this is symbolic interactionism, specifically um, Charles Horton Cooley's concept of the looking glass self, or the self image that is formed from one's own interpretations of other people's views of them. And the looking glass self is affected by three groups or three different types of people or relationships, which are the primary groups, which are someone's closest friends, family, partners, etc. Secondary groups, or slightly below that, they are more impersonal groups characterized by functional or fleeting relationships. So that's like co-workers or other students in a class, especially in like shorter term classes or a temporary job where the relationship is just clearly temporary, or it only exists out of obligation and the function it serves. Um, second Relationships and secondary groups can become relationships in primary groups, but usually secondary groups are just coworkers and fellow students. Um, The other type of group is reference groups, and those are groups that provide standards for judging our attitudes or behaviors. And those are more so the people that someone actively chooses to value the opinions of. So, like if someone wants to know what their closest friends think, then in that situation, the reference group is their closest friends. So reference groups are more so chosen rather than a result of circumstances like primary groups or especially secondary groups maybe. The media example I chose to explain the social issue, and so the media example I chose was the Korean TV show Kingdom. Um, Basically, the premise is the protagonist is the crown prince of ancient Korea. Um, he is trying to figure out whether or not his father is dead so that he can become king, but in the middle of all of that mess, um, he's thrown into a situation where there's monsters attacking people in ancient Korea, and those people who are attacked by the monsters are then becoming more monsters. So it's sort of a zombie apocalypse situation, except it's ancient Korea and no one knows what's actually going on. So throughout this zombie apocalypse, the Crown Prince um, takes actions that demonstrate that he understands how to be a good leader. And there's two scenes that I would like to talk about specifically. that show that. So, firstly, towards the beginning of the series, when the apocalypse is first happening, the crown prince and his court were traveling, and they come across a village where there's peasants who need help, and a zombie horde is basically gonna overrun them and kill them all. And so the prince the prince gets a horse-drawn carriage, so it's one horse and then basically just a big wagon, and he gets all the peasants and some of their belongings onto it, and actually overloads this wagon so that the peasants can be saved from the zombies instead of just saving himself as he would have had the authority to as the crown prince. And then as they're riding away from this horde of zombies that's running after them and chasing them, the prince realizes that because the wagon is overloaded, the horse can't pull it fast enough to actually stay away from the zombies. And he immediately, upon realizing this, jumps out and gets behind the wagon and starts pushing it to save the peasants. And in doing so, he had actively endangered himself. And then the second scene is one where the crown prince seeks out a distant uncle who lives as a peasant, and basically he goes there to try and understand what the needs of the people are during everything that's going on. And um, he talks to his uncle, and his uncle quotes something from a book that the royal family has to read in order to understand how to be good leaders. And the prince reveals himself to his uncle and says that even though his uncle lives as a peasant, royal bloodlines can't be hidden. But the uncle responds by saying that um, regardless of whether or not the blood isn't a crown prince or a low-born peasant, it's still equally important in the same blood, so royal bloodlines don't really matter. And then the crown prince um, adds on to that and says that in their country, their greatest asset is blood because it remains strong over time. And in that moment, he sort of demonstrated that he understands that um, the royal family isn't worth more or superior to the peasants because of their political position, and that all of the people in Korea, from peasants to nobles, are all equally valuable to their society. And so, to reflect on this and explain how the sociological lens of symbolic interactionism ties back into it, um, so the Crown Prince's primary and secondary groups may have been nobles, government officials, and other people of high society, but he specifically made his reference groups be the people he was meant to serve, which were the peasants, which he demonstrated by saving peasants in the overloaded wagon and actively seeking out his uncle who lived as a peasant to figure out what the peasants needed during the situation. And to go back to American politicians and world leaders in general who may not serve their people, I think that from the symbolic interactionist perspective, um, it's because American politicians make the reference groups be um, something other than the people they're supposed to serve. So it's the reference groups who are going to be other members of their own political parties, the capitalist class, lobbyists, and so because the reference groups were not the common people of America, they failed to um, serve the people. And so, what I would take from it, from the symbolic interactionist analysis of American politicians, is that what common people can do to try and mitigate this problem is try and make themselves the most available as possible to politicians, even though politicians are inaccessible and don't uh, serve or seek out the people. The people can still protest, write letters, or call the office of their own representative to try and make their own voices heard to increase the chances of the politicians listening and serving the people instead of themselves or otherwise.